and welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is my second video and I'm going to show you guys how to make sourdough bread. I accidentally cut the bread before filming this, so I have two halves of my bread, but look how beautiful it is. So I'm going to teach you how to make beautiful bread just like this. It's going to be so fun. And I wanted to make this video just because when I started making sourdough bread, it was hard to figure out what to do when my conditions weren't the same as like what was in the recipe. So a lot of people recommend that you have an ambient temperature of 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the fermentation and proof times follow from that. But since where I was a lot colder, I tried to follow like that 5 to 6 hour mark, and then my dough never turned out properly. And then I was also scared to overproof because they warn you a lot about that in the recipes. So I didn't want to like go too much past the time, and my bread turned out kind of dense. But since then, I've experimented with a lot of different fermentation times, fermentation temperatures, water temperatures, and all of that. And I found out what works best for me in different environments, and I just wanted to share that with all of you guys so you can make a bread this beautiful. It's so nice. Okay, and now let's get into the recipe. So if you're super extra like me, step 0 will be to grind fresh flour. These are rye berries, and you can buy them at the grocery store in the bulk food section. You just want to grind them up. I'm going to be using 20% rye and 80% bread flour in this recipe. If you don't have a fresh grinder, you can just buy rye flour from the store, or whole wheat flour, some sort of whole grain flour would be best. The remaining percentage can be all-purpose or bread flour. If you just like white bread, you can use 100% bread flour or all-purpose flour. So you just put some of the grains in, and we're going to grind it up. So I have my sourdough starter here. Right now we're going to make the Levain, or the pre-dough. You're just going to take a little bit of your sourdough starter and then mix it with some water and flour to like feed it a little bit more so it can be strong enough to leaven, raise your sourdough bread. And so first we're going to take 30 grams of water, about 30 grams, 30 grams of rye flour, around 15 to 20 grams of sourdough starter. And as you can see, my sourdough starter is quite alive. You can see by the big bubbles. And then just mix that all up. Nice! Okay, so now my levain is ready, and I'm just going to let it sit out overnight. So that's going to be around 8 to 10 hours, and then in the morning I'm going to AUTOLYSE my flour and water, which just means like mix it together. The flour can completely hydrate. Then we'll start making the bread. So usually in recipes, it'll tell you to leave your levain out for about 4 to 6 hours, but that's usually in like a 72 to 80 degree environment. Right now it's nighttime and it gets to be about like 65, 68 degrees. So it's quite a bit cooler than the 70 to 80 degree temperature that most recipes recommend. Actually with sourdough, the colder it gets, like it can get 2 times slower in yeast bacteria development. So that's why it's taking about double the time to get my levain ready. And tomorrow we'll make bread. Good morning. Now I'm going to AUTOLYSE my dough. I'm going to mix in flour and water and let the water fully hydrate the flour before we mix in the levain. And hydration levels are weight of water to the weight of flour in your dough. I have 433 grams of warm water. I tend to use warm water just because when it's cold out right now, the warm water kind of makes up for the colder temperature. I'm using 432 grams of water, and then I'm going to use 500 grams of flour. So that's going to bring my hydration to about 86%. For people who are just starting out, it's probably best to use a lower percentage of water, maybe around like 60 to 70%, just because the wetter the dough is, the harder it is for it to handle. Right now I'm putting in rye flour, and I used 100 grams of rye flour, so now I'm going to use 400 grams of bread flour. I much prefer bread flour to all-purpose flour when you're making sourdough, just because it has an extra 2% of protein, and that really does make a difference. I used to make it with all-purpose flour, and it didn't have as much structure as the bread flour brings to it. And now I'm just going to mix it up. And one thing to keep in mind is that your dough will be very wet and mushy basically, and that's totally normal. One thing to make it easier is just to use a dough scraper, so you can use that if you don't want to get your hand as nasty, but it's just part of the process and you kind of get used to it. So as you can see, it's very gloppy, but that's perfectly normal. You just want to mix it so that there are no more dry flour spots, and then you should be good to go. So I'm going to let my dough autolyse for about an hour to 2 hours. You can do it for as long as or short as you want. It's not like a necessary step, but it does help with speeding things up later. Okay, so mine is pretty much done now. And I'm just going to scrape all this dough off my hands and put it to rest next to my levain. And you want to leave it covered. Here is my autolyse dough, and here is my levain. So if you look, the levain is quite like bubbly. There's lots of holes in it. So it's pretty ready to go now. I'm just going to mix in the levain. I'm just going to mix it together. I just take it and just like squish it around a lot. As you can see, the dough is a lot more elastic, I would say. So I just do this motion where I kind of just like slap it against the back of the bowl. And this helps it incorporate. And then I take my dough scraper, scrape it all up. The dough now, compared to when we autolysed it, like it sticks so much less, and that's great. And it'll start sticking to your hands less and less as the dough begins to develop. You want to wait a little bit before you add the salt, just because salt will slow down the fermentation. So you want to give it that 30 minutes. So here I have 13 grams of salt, which makes the salt percentage about 2.6%. I think most recipes say you should stay around 1.8 to 2.2%, but just because I really like salt, I tend to put more. Now we're gonna do some stretch and fold. I think my dough is a bit more like sticky and dense just because I put quite a bit of rye flour in. So if you use mostly bread flour, your dough will look quite different to mine. But it's okay, it's all the same process no matter what type of flour you use. Here I have this bowl of water, which I'm going to dip my hands into every once in a while just to keep it from sticking too much. And so first you want to scoop up the dough, and then slap it over itself. So you scoop it and then you slap and fold. And something you might notice is that it'll like tear a little bit, but that's fine. You just keep doing it until it stops doing that, basically. You want to make sure to wet your hands every once in a while just to make sure it doesn't stick. That's literally like the most annoying thing about making sourdough, is how much it sticks to everything. And you would think that you would want to add more flour, but that's actually the complete opposite of what you want to do. You just want to add water. And like, it will up your hydration levels, but the higher the hydration, I think the more open the crumb. I'm honestly not really sure. I just use high hydration levels because I read that that makes for good bread and it's not too hard to work with. So with this slap and fold technique, you like scoop it by the front and the bottom, you stretch it out, you slap it down, and then it's kind of like a wrist movement to fold it over itself. Like a flick of the wrist. My dough looks pretty good right now. It's not sticking too much to myself or to the counter, so it's probably ready to go back into the bowl and bulk ferment. Okay, I'm just gonna call it. So this is what my dough looks like right now. It's quite it's a lot more like elastic than it was before. And now I'm just going to plop it into the bowl and let it sit for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to come back and do some stretch and folds. That is another way to develop gluten, and it's a lot less messy than slap and folds. When I was just starting out, I mainly only did stretch and folds because I didn't want to touch the dough that much because then I would have to constantly wash my hands, and I have really dry hands. So I just chose not to do that. And now that I've like moved up in my sourdough bread making, I've decided it's time to start slapping and folding. There are honestly so many different ways that you can make sourdough, and like so many different techniques that exist, but what matters the most is just like making it work for you. If you don't like to do slap and folds, don't do slap and folds. If you only want to do stretch and folds, like you'll still develop gluten and your bread will still taste like bread. So now we want to do some stretch and folds, and so what you do is you take one corner and then you stretch it as much as you can and then fold it over. And then you just keep doing that all the way around. You also want to keep your hand wet just so the dough won't stick to you as easily. So you want to stretch it all the way and then fold it over. It helps to develop gluten. Once you've gone one full time around, that's one set of stretch and folds. Then you just clean your hands off and then let it rest for another 30 minutes, and you're going to do another set. Total, I would do around 3 to 4 sets of stretch and folds every 30 minutes throughout bulk fermentation. Okay, see, my hands are getting cleaner and cleaner each time I touch the dough. Hi, so now I'm back for the second set of stretch and folds. So you want to stretch it out as far as you can and fold it over. And you want to do it without breaking the dough, tearing the dough, breaking the dough, yeah. So usually the first two are like super long, and then the last one gets a lot shorter just because the dough is, I don't know, it tenses up, the gluten tenses up. I just wet my hands to try and get the dough off of it for one last stretch and fold. So we have this like temperature thingy. So let's see. It is about 68 degrees right now. I think most recipes, the ambient temperature that they aim for is around 75 to 80 degrees, and that's why when those recipes have their bulk fermentation, usually the time is only 4 to 6 hours. But when I started making bread, I realized that that's definitely not enough time. I was in Sweden when I started making bread, and I think around like 50, 60 degrees or so. My bulk fermentations, whenever I let them go for 4 to 6 hours, it would always come out really dense and really underproofed. And I learned that I needed to let it bulk ferment for a lot longer. And right now, since it's around 68 degrees, I'm gonna let mine bulk ferment for about 8 to 10, maybe 12 hours. It really just depends. I'm just gonna check on it every once in a while and see how it's going. I'm gonna do one more set of stretch and folds. This is what the dough looks like right now. And then I'm just going to let it sit out and bulk ferment for the remainder of the time. And I'll show you guys what it looks like after the third set of stretch and folds, and then when I think it's ready. I forgot to do the last set of stretch and folds, but that's okay. Usually I'll do stretch and folds for 2 to 3 hours in the beginning of bulk fermentation, and they'll be spaced 20 to 30 minutes apart. Next we have shaping, proofing, baking, and tasting, and those will be in my next 2 videos. I hope you guys liked this one, and you'll like and subscribe down below. And this is my sourdough Instagram, and it would mean a lot to me if you guys followed that as well. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!